Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar on raising children with bipolar disorder. At the end of our conversation today, we'll have questions for you to ask Tracy, and you can send them via the Zoom question box or on our live Facebook page. As many of you know, being a parent of a child with mental health illness can be very challenging. And today, Tracy is going to share her journey, trials and tribulations on raising 2 children with bipolar disorder. Tracy is an award-winning mental health writer. She's the founder and executive director of BPChildren and the author of multiple articles, essays, and books. Her works have appeared in Pediatrics for Parents magazine, Calgary's Child magazine, the STARFISH Advocacy Association, the Child and Adolescent Bipolar Foundation site, and newsletters on eHow family. Good morning, Tracy, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
We appreciate you taking time out of, I'm sure, your very busy schedule just to share your experiences and what you've learned, and so hopefully we can learn a lot from it. I'd like to start by having you share just a little bit about your journey, how you came to learn that your children had bipolar disorder.
Okay. So for that, we get to do a little bit of time travel this morning. We have to go clear back to the fall of 1999. So I'm going to pretend I'm not really that old, but
okay, yeah, me either.
My then 6-year-old son had his first depressive episode in that year. And, you know, before that time, I had never thought of him as a sad child. He had been a very difficult child, for sure. And as an infant, he had been very sensitive to light and sound. You know, I'd already learned that I had to parent him differently than my other children by that point. But in the fall of that year, he started really expressing some very scary thoughts to us. And I entitled this part, Learning to Listen, because that was kind of how the journey began, is learning to listen to him and believe what he was saying to me. So at 6, even though he was so young, he was very articulate about his feelings. So he started saying things like, I want a car to run me over.
Wow.
I want the neighbor's dog to bite me. You know, he was expressing that he wanted to be harmed. And, you know, my first response to that as a parent, as a mother, was, oh, no, honey, no, you don't want that. You know, I didn't really believe that he could feel that way. Because it was a very foreign idea to me, the idea, you know, of being depressed. It wasn't something that I had experienced personally. He also, about that time, started telling me about dreams that he was having, very graphic dreams, and they were also somewhat disturbing. And again, my response to it initially was not to listen to it, like, don't say that, you know, you can't talk about that. That's really, yeah. And so, you know, we kept kind of thinking that this was something that was going to pass. It wasn't really how we felt, but it persisted. It kept going on. So he would make drawings for me, and he would draw a picture of me and a picture of him. And inside, to represent our brains, for me, he would draw this very neat spiral line. And inside his brain, he would draw all these squiggle lines going everywhere. So he was really trying to communicate to me what was going on inside him and how he felt. And there was a couple of things that kind of started to get to a turning point where I started listening more to him and believing it and realizing that this wasn't going to go away. And there was kind of 2 incidents that happened, and one of them, we were at a religious meeting, and the speaker was talking about the religious man Job, the biblical man Job. And so the speaker says, Job was so sick that he wanted to die. And my son sitting next to me, he turned to me and he lit up his whole face. He just smiled from ear to ear. And I'm thinking, oh, he's happy. Look, you know, what's going on? And he says to me, like me. I found somebody like me. And I, you know, I was crushed. It was just really, you know, how do you compute that as a parent?
Right.
That your 6-year-old doesn't want to live? You know, that it's really, that moment, it will always stay with me. And so at this point, I'm taking it more seriously, but I don't know what to do. Really don't know where to turn. So then the biggest turning point is he came to me and he said, Mom, I need to talk to you. He's 6. You know,
that's very young to be able to have that type of a conversation.
Yeah, it was. So I'm like, okay, you know, and so he said, in private. So he takes me in his room and we sit down. And he said, I feel uncomfortable most of the time. And I said, oh, okay, you know, what's wrong? You know, your shoes too tight? You know, I'm thinking mom things, you know.
You don't like your backpack or
right, what's going on in your life that's making you uncomfortable? And he told me, he said, it's like my shirt's on backwards and there's a tag that's rubbing me wrong all the time. And, you know, at this point, I'm realizing he's not talking about his clothes. You know, I said, you mean your shirt is, he said, on the inside. And so I said, are you sad? And he said, yes. And I said, but you know, honey, sometimes it seems like you're happy. I see you sometimes you're laughing, or it seems like you can still have fun. And he said, even when I'm happy on the outside, I'm sad on the inside.
Wow.
So, you know, at that point, it was a complete turning point for me because I had to do something to intervene. I knew this wasn't going to go away. And I had, you know, he's asking me in every way his 6-year-old self can for help, you know, and so I decided I would help, you know, now knowing what to do.
Different story.
That's a completely different story. Yeah. You know, so, you know, I'm still thinking depression. We're dealing with a depression. And so I start, you know, I read a couple books, I go to my library, I find information about childhood depression. And you know, there was a few paragraphs here and there about bipolar disorder. And I knew that there was family history. I knew there was family history of bipolar disorder. But that didn't mean a single thing to me at that time. I had no clue what that meant, you know? And so, you know, we reassure him, we're gonna help you, we're gonna help you feel better. And I make probably the first mistake. And that is, I go down to my local health food store and I choose a product, a natural supplement. And I'm not against natural supplements, alternative medication or complementary medication. But for us in this moment, it was the wrong choice. So I started giving him this supplement thinking, okay, you know, he's going to start feeling better. Everything's
a place to start.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so within a few days, it shot him up into what I now know was a mixed episode. Mm-hmm. So now, not only did we still have the depression, which it didn't touch, he had the manic energy that goes along with being shot up. So into this higher mood state. So he became angry, he became agitated, he became restless, he's now throwing things and hitting things. And I was like, oh, okay, wrong thing.
Right.
And,
it was a natural supplement. Who knew?
Who knew we could do this? No, I had no clue. And of course, later I learned that this is a very typical response for, children who have bipolar disorder. So we immediately stopped the supplement. And we're thinking, okay, at least we'll go down to baseline and we can start again.
Yeah.
And that's not what happened, because, he had already been pushed into this state and he remained there. So at this point, we knew it was time to turn to medical help. And we took him to his pediatrician, who ran blood work, did a full physical, and right away she saw that he needed assistance. And so their office actually made an emergency appointment for us the next day with a local child psychiatrist. Now, for people who are in this world, this doesn't happen very often.
No.
People wait months. And
yeah.
Months.
Yeah.
And I was terrified. To be honest with you, if she had just handed me his number, I don't know what I would have done with it. And I don't even know why I was so scared to take him to a psychiatrist. But I was terrified. But they had called, they had scheduled the appointment. I knew
you were committed.
I was committed. So we went, and that doctor spent an hour with us after working us into his schedule.
Wow.
Which again is not the typical experience that parents have.
Right.
So we were blessed in that, and right away, he took a careful history. He looked at what was going on and his symptoms, and he said, we have to proceed as if we may be dealing with bipolar disorder. We don't want to do anything that will make it worse. And again, I'm so blessed, because if you look back at the year we're talking about, the average time that a child would go from their first onset of symptoms to getting correct treatment, you're talking sometimes 10 years.
Years, yes.
Yeah. And so there was a real head start for us out of the gate with getting put into the right direction. So that led to, another child eventually being diagnosed. 2 of my 4 children are diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It led to 2 decades of advocacy and 5 books later, and here I am talking to you.
So. Yeah, wow. Thank you so much for sharing. I know that's a personal story, and I'm sure lots of heartache and trial and error just during that period of time, and especially with children, it's hard to diagnose correctly at the start. So thank you so much for that.
Absolutely.
Can you speak a little bit about the feelings of isolation as a parent, raising a child with mental health illness, especially again in that time frame? As the reduction of stigma is still in process, but certainly 20 years ago was probably more. And then a little bit about how it came to create BPChildren.
Okay, sure. We worked really hard to try not to be isolated. But by nature, this illness tends to isolate families and parents. I think the first way it did that, and this was true of mine too with the diagnosis, is they suffer from a lot of anxiety, a lot of social anxiety. So, normal play dates were very difficult. Normal type of sleepover things pretty much impossible to happen. So right away there's some isolation that happens. And I think the other way the isolation happens is just different shared experiences. You're with a group of mothers, maybe of typical children, and their mothers like to brag a little bit. Okay, let's be honest. We all do it a little. But, they're talking about, how Johnny just won the award in school for perfect attendance or this or that. And all you can do is kind of sit there and smile. And, what is that last night you spent the night up with your child who was having hallucinations and couldn't even attend school the next day, or you were happy if he could make it for half a day. And how do you, express that to somebody who doesn't understand?
Yeah.
No, my child made it for half the day.
Right, all the way till 1 o'clock. Yeah.
And yet you are happy for those little things and the little successes that you feel like, it just alienates you from this. And it's not that they're trying to do that.
Right.
But one thing we did from the get-go is I was extremely vocal about it with everyone. I wasn't ashamed. I never was. And so I would talk about the illness. I would talk about the condition. And it just amazed me when I gave people the opportunity to support us, they were more likely to do that, instead of cutting myself off. And so many times somebody would say, oh, my nephew is going through this, or, you know what, my mother suffered from this or that. And so it gave me an opportunity to have a shared experience with them.
And I think that's really powerful when you share your life, because so many people are managing bipolar disorder and other mental health illnesses, and way to create support for yourself, but also just in the community.
Absolutely. And we really did receive a lot of support from the outside, from my family, from, I made friends. I definitely joined some online communities right away. I was involved with that. Made friends in real life with people who had children with bipolar disorder. And I learned that even within that community, there's such a range of functioning for the children.
Right.
That our experiences are different, but when we come together and share them, then it becomes pretty powerful.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the illness, but particularly in bipolar disorder, that it looks so different from person to person. So what it looks like for Johnny isn't going to look like the same for Susie. So that's a
absolutely. Even within our own family, within my two that were diagnosed, my daughter had a very different presentation than my son. And again, in the beginning, we didn't think we were dealing with bipolar disorder, but because the symptom presentation was different. So
different, yeah.
And what works as far as treatment options, it changes from child to child.
Very different, well. Yes.
Yeah. So it does kind of, I would say, the other side of isolation is it does put you in a unique club, with people, and you do kind of make these other friends, and it's if you avail yourself of that world.
Right.
And with the internet now, it's an easy thing to do. Now, what I found was lacking, and where I started BPChildren was, once I got, very important for me to, and so rewind 1999, just the beginning baby resources starting to be available for parents, and nothing for kids. And I was desperate to, I felt they deserved as much validation and information as we did as parents, but in a way that they could digest and understand.
Right, absolutely.
So I started my website with the goal of directly speaking to the children, and so we did, in the beginning, newsletters for kids, and we had coloring pages for kids, and, other kids' their comments, so they could see how other kids felt. Wow. And then, my first book for children. So that was really where my focus was at that moment. And then it expanded, because I realized for them to be successful, they really had to have an entire support group themselves. They needed their siblings to understand, their parents to understand, their teachers to understand.
Yeah. Wow, thank you so much for that work. And I really appreciate just your statement that you are not ashamed. And I think that is super powerful, and hopefully we can spread that message and help people to come out in the light and speak and get support and not be ashamed. It's a brain disease, and if you had cancer, you wouldn't be ashamed. And so I appreciate that statement. That was great.
And it's freeing.
We know that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I just said it was freeing. It's a freeing thing too when you can speak about it like that.
I can imagine. And we know that diagnosing bipolar in children can be tricky, and as you mentioned, it can take years. Can you share with us a little bit about some of the warning signs that you saw in your kids, and then maybe some helpful tactics or thoughts in speaking with your pediatrician and trying to get their support?
Right. So now in retrospect, you know, looking back, there were things that are very typical that happened to my kids that I hear other parents say, this happened to my child. You know, it wasn't that it was something diagnosable at the time, but they were warning signs ahead of time that I wasn't aware of. And so very common, you know, we do hear parents saying, and this was true in my case with my son, that it's just very sensitive to sensory input. You know, everything would just overwhelm him. And it's a generic, in a way, it's a generic symptom because it can lead to different diagnoses, right, or no diagnosis at all.
Right,
so
they're
it's
just
really
sensitive. Yeah.
Right, it's very hard to know, you know, but it is a very typical thing that I've heard other parents share with me and say, you know, this happened. And so that sensitivity and being very difficult. But for us, it was maybe a little easier in that his first episode was a clear depression, because some parents don't get as much of that clearly happening, or maybe it was just that he could express it to us clearly.
Yeah, it sounds like he did an incredible job for a young child and trying to express what he was feeling. That's pretty amazing.
He really did. But so I would encourage, you know, as far as the doctor visits and the first doctor visit, one thing as parents that we tend to overlook at sometimes is just behavior. And so, but what a doctor is looking at is how the illness affects them in these 4 ways: the energy, moods, thoughts, and behaviors. So, you know, as far as going to a doctor visit and trying to communicate well with the physician, I think mood charting is very important. Keep a record of sleep patterns, see those energy changes, the moods, because if we're not in tune with it and aware, then we can't communicate it well to the doctor. And then what does the doctor have to go on?
Right.
You know, so keeping a chart with that. Right away, we started having our own children chart their moods as well, which was a super nice thing to do because they could start becoming in tune with their own emotions.
Yes. Did you have all 4 of your children do that?
Well, at this point, my younger 2 were too little.
Okay.
So it was the older 2 with bipolar disorder. Now, as they grew and the younger ones grew, you know, they were involved in some of that too. And in fact, you know, certain even natural supplements that we did use later on, they would take them too because their brother and sister were, and it was,
right,
you know,
extra support.
extra support, right? So, but I would say, you know, being thorough and charting the moods, and then before you go to your doctor, I would say, you know, sit down. You can't just give them all this stuff, and they're not going to be able to sort through it and process it. Usually, you've got what, like 15 minutes.
Yeah, if you're lucky.
Right?
Yeah.
So, you know, you kind of have to distill that information for them. You know, if you go in and all you talk about is the latest behavior that has been troublesome, perhaps it's like an attentional thing or an anxiety thing, then that's all the doctor's going to focus on because that's all the information you gave. But if you come in and say, well, you know, the sleep patterns have been thus, and, you know, he's expressed these sorts of thoughts, his moods has been this, you know, give them a more complete picture to work with.
Yeah.
And you're going to get a better diagnosis on the other end of things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense just for all of us. You know, the more information and knowledge that anybody that's trying to help has, then the more comprehensive I think that conversation will be.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you so much for that. My next question goes to for parents and caretakers. Are there some suggestions for parents and caretakers when their child first gets diagnosed, taking care of yourself, taking care of them? And then are there things that maybe you would have done differently now that you've been through the experience?
I think the biggest message I want to send here is you are not helpless. You know, when we first get that diagnosis for our children, it can feel so devastating, and you feel helpless. You feel like you're at the mercy of everyone else, of the doctors, of the teachers, of everybody in your life. And I really want people to think about this differently. This is the moment really to take charge. You're going to be the constant feature in your child's life. You're the one who's seen all of the progression until now of his symptoms. And you're the one who's going to be here, you know, on into the future. Teachers come and go. Doctors come and go. Therapists come and go. So I want you to think of it as being like the manager of a team. Okay? So, you know, your goal is to move your child to wellness. That's the goal, right? That's what we want for our kids. We want them to not have the symptoms that they're experiencing, to be as well as they can be. And so you want to pick members of the team that are going to help you to that goal. And realize that you can change those members of that team if you need to.
Great point.
And sometimes you have to. We had one experience I'll share briefly. We moved and we had our team was changing, and we went to a new doctor. And without going into details, I'll say that I sat in the car and cried after I saw that doctor. It was not a good experience. And I went home, you know, and I'm talking to my mother. My mother has a lot of wisdom, as all mothers do.
Yes.
And I said something about when I was going back to the doctor, and she looked at me and she said, "Tracy, why would you ever go back to a doctor who made you cry? Why?" And at that moment, I realized, you know, I don't have to do that.
Right.
I can choose to take him somewhere else. I can change the team up a bit.
But how wonderful for somebody to say that, because when you're in the moment, sometimes you don't always think that or feel that. And, you know, in our medical systems or whatever your situation is, you I'm sure can feel like you're stuck. So that must have been a powerful moment for her.
And sometimes you feel that way even about treatment, like you have no say. You know, you are a powerful voice for your child. If you don't speak up for your child, who will? If you see that a medication is, you know, doing this side effect or that side effect, you know, be verbal, speak up, make sure that it's known. And, you know, it's so, now all of a sudden the illness is not controlling you. You have a certain amount of control of the situation. So I would say that's my first real thing. The other thing I want to say is keep a positive attitude about your child. You know, these pictures are actually in my teacher book, but, you know, sometimes we get so used to viewing a list of symptoms and what's going on, and you know, no wonder we're doing mood charting, we're
right, or what they can't do, or what they're not able to accomplish.
Exactly. Yeah. And yet, you know, our kids are so much, and there's such a beautiful side to them, and they're just don't forget those positive things. Those are things that we need to hold on to too.
Yeah. Well, I love your spirit of advocacy, and can see why you are so successful in helping your kids. And along those lines, as a parent of all children, we can get exhausted and overwhelmed. And so I'm wondering if you could share some of the self-care and coping strategies that you developed through your journey?
Yeah. Oh.
I know it's hard for any mother, I think, to do that, but very important. So
right. So what I'll say about this is that one of the coping mechanisms, it kind of goes back to part of the last question you asked too about, is there something you would do different? Don't get bogged down in guilt. You're going to make mistakes. It's going to happen. Some days you're not going to cope.
Yeah.
It's just, that's the way it happens.
Yeah.
Some days our kids have a bad day. We have to be willing to forgive ourselves, to forgive our children, and to go on and start fresh the next day and not bring that guilt forward with us, because it just, it really bogs us down in the process. As far as coping strategies, what was really important for us was stress reduction. Stress reduction. I can't say it enough, stress reduction, because we needed a calm atmosphere. When your child feels like this, when they feel like they're trapped inside of all of these very difficult emotions, they need the calm. And so having that calm environment helps you, and it helps them as well. Another thing that we found really to be helpful was going along with this is low expressed emotion, the use of low expressed emotion. So if you don't know a lot about it, it's probably a good thing to look into. And pretty much the higher that the more intense my child would react, the calmer I needed to be. So when they're in a position where they're feeling out of control, they kind of need you to be that lighthouse. And it's a little counterintuitive to how parents of typical children do it. If their child is having a meltdown, that's the time they want to crack down and say, I'm the one in charge, and I'm the authority.
Absolutely.
And, that's kind of that's the attitude that you get. But for our children, what happens is when they're having one of these events is, there's no thinking with the logical part of their brain. The executive functionings are offline when they're in the middle of a meltdown, when they're having one of these strong emotional reactions. So they're thinking with the very emotional part of their brain. And so our job at that point in time is only to help them calm down. After they calm down and that logical part of the brain can kick in again, then we can worry about training and teaching, because they're not going to learn anything while they're in the middle of having a meltdown.
Right.
It's not the time to, what it is the time to teach is coping mechanisms and de-escalation and how to get back in control. You want to teach them how to get back in control of their own emotion. And so, we had things like in our house set up, we had a calm corner for each of the kids that they could, they got to design it themselves, and they picked out their favorite things. So whether it was a book or music, it was not a punishment corner. It was their special place they could go to calm themselves. And so we tried to teach them those coping strategies. And they're the same ones that help us as parents.
I was going to say, I might have to make myself a calm corner when I get home.
Absolutely. And for us as parents, we have to make sure that we don't lose our own identity in all of this, because it's a little bit, it's not a little bit, it's all consuming. It tends to just eat all of your time, all of your attention. You're running to this doctor, this specialist. I swear we saw every specialty in the world. And so you feel like that's your whole life. And so even if it's a little bit somewhere, to carve out an interest of your own that you can maintain.
Wow, that's great information. Thank you so much. I want to talk a little bit about school now.
Okay.
You had mentioned earlier that, some days that were a success is just having your kids stay in school for half a day. So can you share with us what you learned about navigating through the school system and some of the interventions that you found helpful in supporting your kids?
Yeah, school really can make a huge difference for our kids, for good or for bad, in how things go, whether or not you have understanding teachers, whether or not they're getting the support they need in the school environment. So both of my children had IEPs. Again, thinking of it as you're the manager here and these are players on your team. The hard thing is that you have to educate those players. They don't come pre-educated about how to deal with a student with bipolar disorder. And a lot of times they're lost and they're looking for resources.
Right.
So helping the teacher.
I would imagine a lot of times they're looking to you for those answers as the parent. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's so overwhelming, because you walk in there, especially if I know those out there who've been to IEP meetings, you walk in and you feel very outnumbered.
Very.
And all these professionals. But one thing that I found helpful is I would always come in very prepared. I had a folder for each teacher with a picture of my child on the front, with an agenda of what I wanted to talk about, with information about their condition, how it affected them in school. So when you come in prepared like that, then they count you as a little bit more of an equal player on the team.
Yeah. I would imagine just seeing your advocacy, and it puts some legitimacy, if you will, to the condition and to your child. Not that they're just, I'm sure they come up with lots of things, throwing a tantrum or just can't pay attention. But I would imagine that when they see the work and the commitment that you have to your child, that probably creates a pretty strong bond there at the beginning.
And that means you have to understand your child.
Yeah.
And what we learned early on is I call it, it's like an onion because there's layers. Okay, it does make you cry too, but
good point.
It's because there's layers and layers of need, and you peel back one layer and you find another. For us, we were dealing also with auditory processing disorder, and we were dealing with some disabilities in writing that was happening. And so there were other layers to this. It wasn't, bipolar disorder it has lots of friends, I like to say. It comes along with extra things. And so you kind of have to peel it back layer by layer to understand the need. The other thing, and I want to point out, this is on my website, this level of stability in school, and it's a really good thing to give to teachers. I also have a sample list of accommodations, because sometimes teachers want to jump from, and parents too, everybody, our child's had an episode and they've had a really hard time, and maybe we've made an adjustment and now we want to jump from sick to well. And it doesn't work that way. There's a progression that happens, and I kind of view it like a teeter-totter. When they're very ill, it's apparent to everybody. But when they start getting better, they're still not well. They're this teeter-totter, and how we help them in their environment during that time can either push them towards wellness or push them back to too much stress and illness. So, we have to look at what happens in each of these stages, what our goal is for the child at that stage, and then how flexibility in school can help. So definitely extended time for homework, maybe no homework, extended time on tests. Really, really important is a safe place and person to go in school when they feel overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. Could be another teacher, could be the school nurse, whoever makes them feel safe, and even a pass out of class. My son used that in high school. And to be honest, it was one of the best accommodations he had that he never had to use, because once he had it, he wasn't trapped.
Right, probably knowing that he had that opportunity should he need it, in and of itself provided some support. Yeah.
absolutely did. And so, I mean, everybody's afraid, oh, well, you give them this, they're going to wander the halls, or they're going to, no,
right.
they have to have
every day they'll be stepping out of class. Yeah.
Right. But for him, it was like, okay, I'm safe. I'm okay. I can leave if I need to. And then that was enough that he could stay.
Yeah, that's great. And I really appreciate your point in commenting that even when children, anybody with bipolar, start to get well and look like they're well, there's still so much going underneath. And,
yes.
Talking with so many people that have bipolar disorder, they share that same sentiment, in that when I'm manic or depressed, you can tell that I'm sick. But even when I, look normal, I'm still managing a lot. So I think that's a great point to remember with our kids.
Well, and it takes, the amount of effort that these kids have to put forward to maintain that, when they're still not doing great underneath, but they're trying to function in a normal school environment. And this is why, sometimes they go home and that's when the meltdown happens, because they've held it in all day.
Right. They try to hold themselves together for a whole school day. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then, you get people who say, oh, well, there must be something wrong at home because they only do it at home. When in reality, they've just worked so hard all day, and now they've had their limit. That's all they can do. So if we can help them and ease it up, during the school day, then it helps that transition back to home. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're going to open it up for questions. So if anybody has a question, again, you can send it via the Q&A box on our Zoom session or on our Facebook Live if you have a question too. Okay. So our first question is about your books. So you mentioned that you had written some books. Can you tell us a little bit about them and what topics that they address?
Sure. So when my son first got the diagnosis of bipolar disorder, I naively went down to my local library to check out a book for him to explain to him what bipolar disorder is. And of course it didn't exist. And so that was where I started, and I wrote Brandon and the Bipolar Bear. And it's not meant to be a comprehensive, detail of every symptom that can occur in bipolar disorder. It's not diagnostic at all. It's just a simple story that kids can, it opens a dialogue with the kids.
I was going to say, it's probably a great conversation starter.
Yeah, even if the, Brandon in the book isn't experiencing the same exact symptoms as your child, it still opens that dialogue to say, how are you feeling? And have you ever felt like Brandon in this case? And so that was the first one. And that was in 2001. I actually just put it out as a black and white printed brochure because I just wanted the kids to have, they just needed that. They needed that resource. So then from there, I wrote one for siblings. That's Turbo Max. And it's written like a diary. It's a young boy and his sister, in the course of the book, gets diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And so it's a place where he can talk about his frustrations, his feelings, his fears, and express that. So it helps the siblings feel understood a little bit. It's hard. So after writing those books for the kids, I realized that they also needed a voice. I had learned to listen to my son, but not everybody listens to the kids. And so Intense Minds was by far my most difficult undertaking. I interviewed close to 100 people for that book. All people who had onset of bipolar disorder during childhood. So either they were an adult now whose symptoms happened in childhood, or they were children now. And I just kept asking them, how did this feel? How did it feel with this symptom, with that symptom? And then that would lead to other questions, things that weren't direct symptoms of the illness, but then everybody was saying that they felt this way. And it was hard because it was a very emotional book to write.
Yeah, I bet.
It's stained with tears. Many tears went into that book. But in the end, hopefully it increases compassion and understanding for their experience, what they've gone through.
Oh, fantastic. Can you tell us where we can purchase those books?
Oh, Amazon. All of them are available, and there are links from my website on bpchildren.com, but they're just direct on Amazon.
Okay, fantastic. Not a question, but just a couple of comments coming in, just with so much gratitude for you speaking on this topic and the powerful sharing of your story. So thank you so much for that. The next question is, how do you deal with and take it when your children are yelled at or being bullied or mean things said? Is it really what is being said, or is it the illness in their processing?
Well, that's hard because, you know, there is perceptual difficulties for our kids. You know, research has come a long way in finding out that sometimes they misinterpret facial expressions. Sometimes they misinterpret the emotional meaning of language.
Right.
And I'm sure if you're a parent, you've seen it happen with yourself and your child.
Absolutely.
But, you know, there were several instances that I found in the local neighborhood kids that there were problems. And I think the best way is to just handle it straight on, you know, and go and talk to them and find out, you know, what's going on, what's the intention. And, you know, there were times I found that my son was being bullied. He had a young man at the bus stop throwing rocks at him. You know, he was trapped in a circle of kids who were threatening to, you know, do mean things to him. But then on the other hand, there were times I had to go and apologize to other parents because he was the one who was being aggressive. And you know, it's a hard thing, but I think not ignoring it is important. And, you know, going, investigating, finding out, having a frank conversation with the other parents, and, you know, dealing with it that way.
And then did you find by doing that, could you see, this is my question, just a confidence to support feeling from your son, and how that helped them just continue to process? And
oh yeah, you know, through whatever up and down, you know, my son knew I had his back. You know, and he knew that he could come and tell me, and I would pay attention to that and listen to it, and that we could sort out a problem together. So that was a good thing. And the same for the schools, you know, because sometimes it's not children who are putting them in and I don't know if I want to say bullying, but sometimes that happens with adults too.
Challenging situation.
Thank you. Yes, put them in challenging situations. And the thing is especially when it's an adult in a child situation, you know, even when our children are not interacting appropriately, it's up to the adults to set the example and how to interact appropriately. So we still expect an appropriate response.
Yes.
And because that helps teach our children. And so the adults have to be the adults, but in truth, people get frustrated, and sometimes they do the wrong thing. And sometimes just a simple, kind reminder. I think in everything we do, we have to use kindness with it. You know, be firm, be the strong supporter. But be
have
kind.
An expectation wrapped in kindness.
Yeah. There was one of the advocacy sites, and I'm trying to, they used the phrase, this was Wright's Law, to give the right due credit here, Wright's Law, which has a lot of advocacy books about the school system. And in their trainings, I took a few of those, they said, have an iron fist and a velvet glove.
Perfect. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you so much. Our next question is, how did you handle consequences for behavior and rewards for good behavior, and not making sure you were going extreme on either one.
Yeah. So we tried a lot of different things. You know, we tried sticker charts, and when the kids were really little, and you know, for us, even if something was done during a mood episode, I mean, we ignore small things. But we also had lines that just were not acceptable to cross.
Yeah.
Physical violence was one of those. There was to be no physical, we're not pushing, we're not hitting, we're not, and that's always gonna be a problem. You know, it's always going to lead to a consequence, because in real life, it's never gonna be acceptable. So even if your illness is to that point, you have to find another way to express yourself. At the same time, we were very aware that if he started having trouble controlling himself in those areas, then probably something's wrong with the medications. It needs to be adjusted. You know, so we're going to support you to find an answer. We're going to, you know, make sure the doctor knows that this is going on. But at the same time, you know, there's going to be a consequence. This is never going to be okay. So, and what types of things, and again, it goes back to that level of stability chart that I had for school. The same thing happens for home. You know, it's, we used a lot of the techniques that are in the Explosive Child book by Dr. Green, Dr. Ross Green, kind of was a savior for us. So, you know, we did adjust ourselves compared to the level of stability and expectations. You know, if it was a totally unstable situation, we're mostly concerned with safety. It's all about safety. But then, you know, as they become better and more stable, the expectations are gonna, you know, start increasing along with it.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so much. Next question. Did you have any experience with your 2 children that didn't have a diagnosis, feeling bitter or jealous about the amount of time that you had to spend with your diagnosed children?
I think there's some. I think it works both ways. In some ways, I see that they're, the 2 that don't have the diagnosis are pretty compassionate people and are educated in their own right about the illness. But in truth, it did take away some time and energy. There's just no getting around it. It has to. If you don't focus on the needs of the children, especially when they're very ill, you know, your family life is going to be chaotic.
Right.
So it's going to require some of that. And you know, and I do think about that sometimes. You know, you're talking about the second guessing, or, you know, could I have carved out a little bit more time, or this or that. So they're not bitter. I won't say it that way, but you know, it shaped their lives. It shaped all of our lives. There's just no getting around it. But they also, you know, saw that if they needed something, then that was taken care of as well.
I think it goes back to your point about no guilt. And I think in all families, kids with mental illness or not, something takes precedence in the family at any given time, and you have to work that out as a family unit dynamic just for the forward movement of everybody. So,
and the perspective of every child is going to be different. You know, we had there's a pretty good gap between our older 2 and our younger 2. You know, so even just our age and experience in life, you know, you raise each child a little bit differently.
Yeah, that's so true. So true.
So as one of my younger sons says that he got off easy because, you know, after all of that, like our perspective was so different you know, we don't sweat the little stuff anymore.
Yeah.
The little stuff is like, oh my goodness, that is not a big deal. You hear another parent worried about this or that, and I'm like, really? You know?
Yeah, it's here right now, and it'll be gone in 10 minutes. And I have
exactly. This is nothing. You don't know what we've had to deal with, you know. And so he says he got off easy because we had such a laid back attitude then.
I think a lot of youngest children feel that way. You know, we kind of practice on our first ones and figure out hopefully what we're doing, and then by the time you get to the, you know, third, fourth, fifth,
right.
Like, hey, if everybody's dressed and in the car, we're good.
Right, life is good.
Oh, thank you for that. Our next question is again talking about I think public behaviors, and the question is, how do you deal when someone just yells at you, is mean? Is that a sign of a manic episode? Should you just leave the person alone or approach them directly? I know that's a lot and a probably tough and individual question.
So we're talking about dealing with the public and somebody who it appears has is having a clear mental issue at the time.
Yeah, I think public, and probably, I can't really tell from the question, but probably in a family as well, if somebody's having a manic episode, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, you know, it's kind of like what we talked about when our child is having a meltdown and they can't access that executive functioning of their brains to think clearly, and they just need to calm down. You know, anytime we're in a situation and somebody is being aggressive or yelling or you know, if we respond in kind, we're just it's just like, let's just pour some gas all over this and see how it can
get out of control.
And sometimes, you know, just a kind, calm word can diffuse an entire situation, or if a person is clearly out of control, walking away and not engaging, there's no benefit in engaging with that person. And really, it goes even in adults in a family. You know, the thing is after the children grow up, and they do grow up, you know, they grow up, and now they're the owners of their own illness. And
absolutely,
and they have to find their own way, and they have to make some choices. And you know, we may or may not agree with those. And so there are times in families when people become unstable, and you know, it's not engaging with that when they're in that state. There's just no benefit to doing it. We might have to remove ourselves, you know, from that, and let them find their way a little bit, and let them calm down, let them be able to think clearly again.
Well, I think that is our the last question that we have time for today. But again, I want to thank you so much for your vulnerability and your honesty and sharing your story. I know it's going to bring some hope and empowerment to our audience. And for those of you listening, if you have want any more information, Tracy's website is bpchildren.com or .org? .com. bpchildren.com. You can find more information about all of these topics. We'll have this webinar posted on our website by Friday. So if you want to review or certainly share with other people that you know that could use this information. So thank you again, Tracy. Really appreciate it. And have a great day, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.
I wish everybody peace and stability.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.